Chapter 5. The Arrival of the Dutch and Expulsion of the Portuguese, 1592 to 1642. The Portuguese had no sooner got rid of the English and French than yet a third rival appeared on the Gold Coast. In 1595, Bernard Eriks of Medemblik made the first Dutch voyage and succeeded in establishing very friendly relations with the people, who found his goods were both better and cheaper than those which the Portuguese were in the habit of supplying them. This Eriks had once been taken prisoner by the Portuguese and carried to the island of St. Thomas, where he learned for the first time of the rich trade they had on the Gold Coast. Some time afterwards he was set at liberty and returned to Holland, where he laid his information before some Dutch merchants, who accepted the offer of his services and fitted him out with a ship and cargo to make a voyage to the coast. The first venture, having proved so successful, was quickly followed by others, until in the course of a few years the Dutch had established a regular trade with the Gold Coast. This fresh competition immensely disgusted the Portuguese, who, since they had had the coast to themselves again, had not improved their manner of treating the people, and were as much disliked by them as ever. In 1596, Elmina Castle itself was threatened by one Charles Hutzel, and they were compelled to demolish their original chapel, which stood outside the walls, and build another inside the fortress. They did all they could, however, to counteract the evil effect of the presence of the Dutch on the coast, spreading reports among the people that they were mere slave raiders, setting a price upon their heads, and offering a reward for every one of their ships that should be betrayed into their hands. In consequence of these offers, many Dutchmen were murdered from time to time, though it is not likely that these people paid much attention to the character given them as slave raiders, for they knew by experience that no one was more adept at this than the Portuguese themselves. Amongst others, several Dutchmen were treacherously killed at Cape Coast, where the natives persuaded Captain Simon de Tay to send some of his men ashore with a boat under the pretense that their chief wished to come on board his ship to trade. They no sooner reached the shore, however, than they were furiously attacked and all murdered, with the exception of 2 or 3 who succeeded in swimming off to the ship. In 1596, again, the Portuguese seized a Dutch ship off Cape Coast, killing most of her crew and sending the others as galley slaves to Elmina, where they soon succumbed to the harsh treatment they received. In 1598, they engaged a Negro trader named Veretian to betray a Dutch bark into their hands. Some of his people went on board in an apparently friendly manner, and by tales of the abundance of game to be had on shore, succeeded in inducing 3 of the Dutchmen to land and join them in a hunting party. So soon as they had set foot on shore, however, they were seized and taken to the governor at Elmina as slaves. Meanwhile, others of Veretian's men had remained on board and became so friendly with the Dutch sailors that they, suspecting no treachery, put their gun matches out. The people then fell on them, killing and wounding many and throwing others overboard. Indeed, they would soon have made an end of them all, had not the ship's carpenter, who had been cutting wood ashore, returned on board and attacked them so fiercely with his axe that they were glad to save themselves by jumping into the water and swimming back to the beach. In 1599 again, 5 Dutchmen were becalmed near Elmina as they were passing to Maury by canoe. They were seen by the Portuguese governor, who sent some Elminas out to take them. having wounded all the Dutchmen and brought them ashore, the Elminas then cut off their heads and presented them to the governor. These and their broken limbs were set up on the castle walls as a warning to their countrymen, and their skulls were afterwards made into drinking cups by the natives. In 1600 again, the Portuguese, aided by the Elminas, surprised another Dutch bark, but met with such determined resistance that they were compelled to beat a retreat. In the same year too, the crew of a bark from Oporto, which had been taken by the pirates, put in at Elmina for fresh water and provisions, but though they were Spaniards, the governor refused to supply them and threatened them with slavery if they did not immediately leave the coast. In spite, however, of the continued hostility of the Portuguese, the Dutch succeeded in doing what neither the English nor the French had ever attempted, and founded settlements of their own on the Gold Coast. In 1598 they formed an alliance with the King of Cebu and established a lodge at Mori. The Portuguese, in revenge, came by night and burnt all the fishing canoes, but the Dutch, having thus gained a definite footing in the country, rapidly extended their influence and built two more lodges, one at Cormantin and the other at Butry. The lodge at Cormantin, however, was abandoned very soon afterwards because of the quantity of base metal that was mixed with the gold bought by the people, who then had to come over to Mori when they wanted to trade. The Dutch also supplied the commanders with arms and ammunition and incited them to attack the Portuguese to avenge the attack they had made on the canoe at Elmina. The commanders were joined by the people of Fetu, and the war that ensued lasted several months and cost the Portuguese about 300 men, who were presumably nearly all Africans. But though they eventually managed to come to terms with the Fetus, the commanders refused to owe any further allegiance to them, and the Dutch then built another lodge in their town. These early settlements of the Dutch were merely fortified houses, and even at their headquarters in Mori, the defences consisted only of earthworks, which were continually being damaged by the rains and needed constant repair. An incident which occurred at Mori just before the Dutch settled there shows the favourable disposition of the people towards them. In April 1598, some Dutch sailors landed there for wood and began cutting down some fetish trees. Paying no heed to the warnings and remonstrances of the people, which in all probability they did not understand, the Moors therefore attacked them, killing one of their number and cutting off his head. The next day they brought the murderer on board and asked the Dutch to put him to death in the same manner, but they refused. They therefore took him ashore themselves and beheaded and quartered him, and when the Dutch landed again soon afterwards, they found that their countryman had been decently buried and the murderer's head set up on a spear over his grave. The Dutch did all they could to cultivate the friendship of the people, forming alliances with the different chiefs, encouraging them to defy the Portuguese and assisting them in their wars. When the Moors were threatened by the chief of Ati with a much stronger force, the Dutch lent them 2 cannon and 60 or 70 muskets, which materially contributed towards the complete victory that they gained soon afterwards. It is true that this policy of inciting the people to resist the Portuguese had been tried by the English and French and failed, but the greater success of the Dutch was probably due to the fact that they had formed definite settlements in the country, which gave the people some guarantee that they would not sail away and leave them to bear the brunt of Portuguese vengeance as their predecessors had done. During the next few years, the consistent pursuit of this policy and their fair and just dealings with the people steadily increased the influence of the Dutch, and that of the Portuguese was proportionately diminished. There are 2 castles on the Gold Coast, Christiansborg and Cape Coast, whose early history is shrouded in mystery. They will be considered in greater detail a little later, but may be mentioned here because they are both said to have been founded originally by the Portuguese. The different accounts, however, vary so much that nothing definite can be said to be known about the earliest history of either. In 1621, Philip IV came to the Spanish throne. The Portuguese trade on the Gold Coast, however, had by this time been utterly ruined by the Dutch, who were able to sell their goods more cheaply on the coast than the Portuguese could buy them in Lisbon. The new king, moreover, was far more interested in growing trade with the East Indies than in trifling profits that could be now expected from his possessions in West Africa. Their wealth had paled before the newly discovered riches of the East, and he therefore neglected them even more than his predecessors had done. The Portuguese thus became so weak that they could seldom or never attempt to do anything outside the walls of their forts, though at one time, while they were still strong enough, they had not only claimed but actually exercised sovereign rights over a great part of the coast. One of their last sources of gain was lost to them at about this time. This was the gold mine at Abrobi, which had been opened by Fernando Gomez before the castle was built and had been worked with few intermissions ever since. But by 1622, the hill had been riddled in every direction with badly shored up tunnels and suddenly fell in, burying a number of the workmen beneath it. Jaycee, the chief of Commenda, consulted the fetish priests, who declared that the catastrophe was due to the action of a Sasabonsum who lived in the hill and resented being disturbed. After this announcement, no African could have been induced to reopen or enter the mine, and it had to be abandoned. Ever since they first came to the coast, the Portuguese had been accustomed to obtain large quantities of gold from the Ancobra district, and their fort at Axim had, in fact, been built for this reason. Fear of the Aroweens, who were the only tribe on the coast who used poisoned arrows and who were opposed to any advance of the Portuguese into the interior, had hitherto prevented them from following up this river. But now that their trade had been ruined by the competition of the English and Dutch, and the Abrobi mine had to be closed, they were forced to make an effort to open up some fresh gold-bearing district. To protect their prospectors from the attacks of the Aroweens, an expedition was sent up the Ancobra in boats in 1623, and a small square fort, designed to hold a garrison of about 20 men, was built on the left bank of the river about 15 miles from its mouth. It was called Fort Duma after a stream of that name which joined the river there from the east. This was not accomplished without opposition from the Aroweens, but they were taken by surprise, and the Portuguese had laid their plans carefully and took with them in the boats a number of mantelets made of stout planks and about 7 feet high. These were set up around the site chosen for the fort and effectively screened the workmen from the showers of the arrows that were sent against them when the Aroweens at last arrived on the scene. A desperate attempt was made to carry the position by storm, and was only repulsed by the fire of a gun mounted in the bow of one of the boats, which created such havoc in the densely crowded ranks of the enemy that they were compelled to fall back, leaving nearly 200 of their dead before the fort. Even the Portuguese, protected though they had been behind their screen of mantelets, did not escape unscathed. About half a dozen men were wounded by spears in the final rush, and 2 or 3 Ahanta labourers and the Portuguese received arrow wounds. The latter all ended fatally within a few days with symptoms of tetanus. After this peace was arranged, The Arawains recognized the right of the Portuguese to open mines in the neighborhood of their fort, and the latter undertook not to interfere with any workings that were already in the possession of the people. A rich vein of gold-bearing quartz was soon afterwards discovered in a hill at Aboassi, about 5 miles from Fort Duma. This hill, however, was believed to be the residence of a Sasabonsum, and for some time no labour could be obtained. But in 1630 slaves were brought up from Elmina, and the chiefs, having been won over by the presents and promises, work was commenced. During the next 6 years, it is said that some 2,000 pounds weight of gold was sent to Lisbon from this mine, but this is probably a gross exaggeration. The weakness of the Portuguese gave the Dutch more leisure to improve their own position on the coast. Their first act was to enlarge and improve their post at Maury, converting what had been a mere trading station and redoubt into a substantial stone fort, which, on its completion in 1624, was named Fort Nassau in honor of the House of Orange. It was garrisoned by a strong force of Europeans and native levies, and the command given to Adrian Jacobs. They also built a stone house or lodge on the hill at Queen Anne's Point, but no trade was done there, the flag only being displayed to prevent others from settling there and damaging the trade at Maury. The great ambition of the Dutch, however, was to capture Elmina, and in December 1625 they made their first attempt on it. The Dutch force consisted of 1,200 of their own men, most of whom had been sent out for the purpose, and 150 sabots. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Jan Dirks Lamp. A landing was effected shortly before sunset at Terra Pequena and Penny, a village about 6 or 8 miles to the west of Elmina, but before the Dutch had time to form up they were furiously attacked by a large force of Elminas, who inflicted a crushing defeat, the battle being over before night. In this action the Dutch lost nearly all their officers, 373 soldiers, and 60 seamen, besides their native allies, who were slaughtered to a man. Admiral Lamb himself was among the wounded, and was only saved by the commanders, who opportunely arrived on the scene. The decisive victory must always stand to the credit of the Elminas, who that evening gave such convincing proof of their courage and loyalty. In March 1629, the Dutch States General established the West India Company and handed over to it all their settlements on the Gold Coast, together with any other lands that it might acquire in Africa between the Tropic of Cancer and the Cape of Good Hope. The English, too, encouraged by the great success of the Dutch, had begun to renew an intermittent trade. In 1618, James I had granted a charter to Sir Robert Rich and some merchants of the city of London for the formation of a company to trade to Guinea. This company was called the Company of Adventurers of London Trading into Africa, and several voyages were made, but the results not coming up to their expectations, the promoters withdrew from it, and the charter was allowed to expire. The next company was formed in 1631 under a charter granted by Charles I to Sir Richard Young, Sir Kenelm Digby, and Nicholas Crisp, along with Humphrey Slaney and some others. This charter gave the company an exclusive right to the coast trade from Cape Blanco to the Cape of Good Hope for a period of 31 years. The principal trade at this time was for slaves, the demand for which had been greatly increased by the colonization of the West Indies by the English and the introduction of slave labor into Manhattan by the Dutch. The English had hitherto been content to cruise along the coast and get a cargo of slaves wherever they could, but the growing importance of the trade now led this company to establish posts on the shore to better supervise it. They selected Cormantin as their headquarters and built a large stone fort with 4 bastions there, and afterwards erected lodges at several other places along the coast. Nominally, this company held the sole English rights to trade on the coast, but in reality, the trade remained open and anyone who cared to do so went there. The company tried to stop these private ventures whenever it came to their knowledge that such a voyage was being planned, and in 1637 the Talbot was so stopped, but as a rule their efforts were of little avail, for the promoters of such undertakings nearly always kept their destination secret until they were clear of the last English port. On the 18th of December 1636, the western districts of the Gold Coast were visited by an earthquake, which caused the tunnel and galleries of the Portuguese gold mine at Aberassi to fall in and bury all those who were working in it, with the exception of a single soldier who was on guard near the southern entrance to prevent the escape of any of the slaves and ran out just in time. The sole survivors of the disaster were this man, Juan Rodriguez, Fernan Diaz, and Pedro Gomez, the engineers, and 3 other soldiers. They had all been above ground when the accident happened. That night they camped around the ruins, intending to leave at daybreak and report. The Aroween villagers, however, had shared in the catastrophe, and the fetish priests of course attributed it to the vengeance of the Sasabonsum of the hill and demanded sacrifices to appease his wrath. During the night, therefore, they led the villagers against the little camp and surprised it. 5 of the Portuguese were at once secured, and one of the others was shot down as he tried to make off, but the 7th, though wounded in the thigh by an arrow, managed to escape. The prisoners were then taken into the still open southern end of the tunnel, and there bound hand and foot, and left as a propitiatory offering to the outraged god, while the Arowins tore down the supports of the tottering roof and rolled great boulders of rock over the entrance until it was completely closed up and unrecognizable. The wounded soldier who had escaped saw all this as he lay trembling in his hiding place on the hillside above, and the next morning dragged himself painfully over the 5 miles to Fort Duma, where he died of tetanus from his wound. Here, too, everything was in ruins. The guard-room roof had fallen in, crushing 3 of the soldiers, and all that now remained of Fort Duma was a heap of crumbled masonry, in the midst of which stood a few pieces of rent and tottering wall. The surviving members of the garrison had been awaiting the return of the party from the mine, but when they heard the news of their fate, they lost no more time in abandoning the place and retired to Axim, where they found that Fort San Antonio itself had been much shaken and damaged, and had its walls fissured in several places. Their disastrous defeat at Ampeni had not only made the Dutch any the less anxious to gain possession of Elmina, if anything, the added desire to wipe out the disgrace of that first defeat had made them the more determined than ever. Nicholas van Ypres was now governor of Maury, and had followed the policy of gradually weaning the people from their allegiance to the Portuguese to such good purpose that with the aid of large presents and still larger promises, he had now succeeded in obtaining from nearly every chief on the coast a guarantee that he would join in another attack on Elmina so soon as a favourable opportunity should arise. It is said that he had even contrived to bring about a diversion among the garrison of the castle, having thus paved the way for another attempt on the fortress. Van Ypres wrote to the directors of the Dutch West India Company, telling them what he had done, and assuring them that if they could now supply him with a sufficient force, he had every reason to hope that he would be able to capture the castle. The chief reason for their anxiety to secure this place was that they had already had possessions in Brazil and hoped that if they could establish themselves on both sides of the Atlantic, they would be able to control the trade to the East Indies to the exclusion of all other nations. Moreover, Holland was then at war with Spain, of which Portugal had been a province since 1580, and the Dutch, being unable to effect very much against the Spanish troops on land, had to rely on harassing the enemy at sea, where they were uniformly successful. When Van Yperen's letter was received, Count Maurice of Nassau, a near relative of the Prince of Orange and governor of the West India Company's possessions in South America, was in Brazil with a fleet of 32 ships, including 12 men of war, on board which he had 2,700 picked troops. The news from the Gold Coast was, therefore, forwarded to him with a request that he would dispatch as many men and ships as he could spare from his squadron and send them to Van Yperen's assistance. Count Maurice was so impressed with the importance of this scheme that he decided to go to the Gold Coast himself. He took 9 men of war, well manned and provided with large reserves of ammunition, and gave the command of the troops to Colonel Hans Coyne. The fleet arrived off of Cape Lahou on the Ivory Coast on the 25th of June, 1637, and as soon as the ships had dropped anchor, a letter was sent to Van Yperen at Maury, informing him of the arrival of the troops and asking him to choose a suitable spot for their disembarkation. He was warned to keep their arrival secret, especially from the English, lest they suspect their object and do something to thwart them. The fleet then sailed down to Assini, where Count Maurice had arranged to await the governor's reply. Here, an unforeseen difficulty arose, for the people naturally concluded the ships had come to trade and came off in 18 canoes to barter their ivory. But the Dutch had no trade goods with them, and had to pass them off from day to day, while they sent another urgent message to Van Yperen, begging him to complete his preparations with the least possible delay, for they now lived in continual dread that the people would suspect and reveal their object and possibly ruin the expedition by giving the Portuguese time to prepare for their defense or raising the opposition of the English. These fears, however, were groundless. The people believed they were putting them off in order to obtain better prices, and a few days later came out and said that their fetish had revealed to them that there were 7 other ships on their way to the coast, which would soon arrive and ruin the trade of the Dutch. Van Yperen's reply now arrived, instructing Count Maurice to bring his fleet to Comenda, where he promised to join him. In the meantime, Van Yperen had secured the alliance of the Commenders by promising them large rewards if the castle should be taken, and by the time the fleet arrived, they were ready to join it in 200 canoes. The combined fleets left Comenda on the 24th of August and sailed down towards Cape Coast, where the troops were disembarked early on the morning of the 26th in a little creek about half a mile to the westward of the Cape. This must have been the opening of the lagoon or salt pond at Freetown, which, though usually quite shut off from the sea, has been opened from time to time and must have been permanently connected with the sea until the sand silted up and closed its mouth. The Dutch force consisted of 800 soldiers and 500 seamen, besides the Commenders, who probably mustered between 1,000 and 1,400 men. Each man carried rations for 3 days. They advanced towards Elmina in 3 divisions. William Latan led the advance guard, and John Godlat the main body, while Colonel Coyne himself commanded the rear guard. About midday, they reached the Rio Dolce, the Sweet River, where a halt was called to rest the men and give them an opportunity to have something to eat, while the scouts were sent forward to find out the strength and disposition of the enemy. it was absolutely essential for the Dutch to gain possession of the hill on which the chapel of San Jago stood, for this overlooked the castle on its weakest side and was the only position from which it could be attacked with any reasonable hope of success. But when the scouts returned, they reported that the hill was being defended by a force of about 1,000 Elminas, which had been posted at its foot. 4 companies of fusiliers were, therefore, sent to drive them back, but they advanced too far and were so vigorously attacked by the Elminas that they were repulsed with heavy loss. The Elminas then seem to have imagined that they had already won the day, and cutting off the heads of the fallen Dutchmen, carried them in triumph towards the town. So many went to celebrate their victory in this way, that very few men were left to hold the position, and Major Bongarzen, coming up with a reserve detachment, quickly put this small party to flight with a loss of only 4 of his men and 10 of the native allies. The Elminas then realized too late that the battle had only just begun, and hurrying back from the town, twice attempted to retake the position, but though they fought well and inflicted some further losses on the Dutch, including William Latan and several more men killed, they were eventually driven back into the valley between San Jago and the hills behind it. The few Portuguese who had been with them at once sought refuge in the chapel of San Jago and their redoubt, where they were soon afterwards attacked and forced to surrender. Meanwhile, Colonel Coyne had been having 2 paths cut through the bush, one leading to the summit of the hill and the other to the Sweet River, so that he could obtain fresh water and ascend the hill without using the path made by the Portuguese to their redoubt, for this led up immediately in front of the castle and was covered by its guns. 2 pieces of cannon and a mortar were then brought up and mounted on the hill, whence fire was opened on the castle and 10 or 12 grenades thrown against it, but they did little or no damage, as the range was too great. The Dutch, however, were perfectly safe where they were, for the castle's only means of defence on this side were 2 small cannon mounted over an old walled-up gate, which were quite useless against an enemy on the hill. In the meantime, while the attention of the Portuguese had been engaged by the bombardment of the castle, the commanders had been sent across the river Benya to attack the town, which lay on the opposite bank under its walls, and having advanced under the cover of the banks of the river, now succeeded in driving off all the cattle and sheep. Coyne, who was anxious to avoid risking his men unnecessarily, could not however afford to delay, owing to the limited supplies that his men had with them. At break the next morning, therefore, he sent a trumpeter to summon the castle to surrender, threatening to put all the garrison to the sword if they did not yield quickly. The Portuguese governor replied that the decision did not rest with him alone, but that he must first consult his officers and people. He therefore asked for a 3 days' armistice before giving his answer. Coyne, of course, could not agree to this, or his men would have been starving, and sent word that he would only give him 1 day. Next morning, the trumpeter was again sent to the castle to demand the governor's answer, but the drawbridge was kept raised and the gates closed. Coyne therefore brought up his whole force, and moving the guns nearer to the fortress, renewed the bombardment, whereupon the Portuguese sent out 2 heralds with full powers to arrange the terms of capitulation. These, which were shameful enough to the Portuguese, were agreed upon as follows: the governor, officers, garrison, mulattoes, etc., to march out with their wives and children, but without collars or arms, and take nothing with them beyond 1 suit of clothes each. The Dutch to have all the gold, merchandise, slaves, and other property then in the castle, with the exception of 12 slaves which were to be allowed to the Portuguese as servants. The Portuguese to be allowed to carry away all those ornaments of their church that were not made of gold or silver. The Portuguese to be put on board the Dutch warships and provided with the necessaries of life until they could be landed on the island of San Tome or St. Thomas. Thus the celebrated castle of San Jorge del Mina fell into the hands of the Dutch on Saturday the 29th of August 1637. A Dutch inscription over the main gate still exists recording the event, and a white stone let into the pathway leading from the bridge over the River Benya to the castle marks the spot where the Portuguese governor handed over the keys of the fortress to Colonel Coyne. The garrison had been so reduced by death and neglect that only about 30 men were left to march out the castle, and even they were nearly all sick. The Dutch found very little gold or merchandise in the place, but they took 30 good brass cannon, 9,000 pounds of powder, 800 cannon balls, and 10 casks of musket balls, 300 packages of flints, and 36 Spanish swords, besides a great number of axes, pikes, and other weapons, most of which, however, had been much neglected and were very rusty. It was not want of ammunition, therefore, that had been the cause of the feeble defence made by the Portuguese. Colonel Coyne now left Captain Valraven van Malberg and 140 men to garrison the castle while he went down to Mori to make arrangements for moving the Dutch headquarters to Elmina. At the same time, he sent a letter by canoe summoning the Portuguese commandant at Axim to surrender. He hoped that the consternation following the fall of their principal stronghold would prove sufficient to ensure the submission of any other Portuguese on the coast at his mere word. But he soon found out that this man was not such a poltroon as the governor of Elmina, and the only answer he got was a defiant message challenging him to do his worst, the commandant declaring that, as for himself, he would hold the fort for the king his master until his last breath. With this, the Dutch had to be content for a time, but in 1640, Portugal, taking advantage of the distracted condition of Spain, achieved her independence under the House of Braganza, and war immediately broke out between her and Holland on the question of the possession of Brazil. It was during these hostilities that the Dutch attacked and captured Fort St. Antonio on the 9th of January 1642, and by the Treaty of Peace concluded soon afterwards, the Portuguese formally ceded all their possessions on the Gold Coast to the Dutch West India Company in return for Holland's renunciation of her claims to sovereignty in Brazil. The Portuguese version of the fall of Elmina is entirely different to that of Barbeau and Dapper, which has been given above, but there is no difficulty in deciding which is correct. They say that a Dutch ship anchored in Elmina roads, either to obtain provisions or out of curiosity to see the place, and that her captain became very friendly with the Portuguese governor. They exchanged presents and entertained each other, and the governor also purchased a considerable quantity of the Dutchman's trade goods on his own account, paying for them in gold. Before the ship sailed, the governor invited the captain to return as soon as he could with a large cargo, guaranteeing him a successful voyage and promising to have plenty of gold and ivory ready for him on his arrival. The Dutchman now schemed to take possession of the place, and on his return to Holland laid his plans before the States General. Their approval having been obtained, special short light cannon were cast and packed in boxes to represent cases of merchandise, and quantities of small arms and ammunition were made up into bales to appear like ordinary trade goods. These were put on board a ship with a small supply of the usual articles for the coast trade and presents for the Portuguese governor. But instead of the 30 or 40 men which was the usual complement of a merchantman of 40 guns, 300 picked men sailed in her. 6 months later, she anchored off of Elmina. Presents were sent to the governor, and her captain reported that owing to want of fresh provisions and other privations, sickness had broken out among his men, who were nearly all seriously ill. Therefore, he begged the governor's permission to land them and treat them in a hospital camp on shore. Leave was granted, and a site for the camp chosen on San Diego's hill, where the sick men might reap the full benefit of the sea breeze. Tents were pitched, and the supposed invalids, and incidentally the cases containing the cannon, were carried up in hammocks. Engineer officers, posing as surgeons, accompanied them, and bales of arms and ammunition were landed as medical stores and other necessaries. As it was found that the sick men complained of the intense heat and want of proper ventilation in the tents, it was next decided to erect barracks, a work in which some of the Portuguese soldiers themselves were paid to assist. These were so arranged by the surgeons that they could easily be converted into batteries. The governor and Portuguese officers suspected nothing, being too afraid of possible infection to approach the working parties. They were, moreover, well entertained by the Dutch captain and his officers, who did all they could to distract their attention from the suspicious number of loads that were being taken up to the camp. In 2 days' time, all the arms and ammunition had been disembarked, and the Dutch then began to raise earthworks under cover of the temporary walls of the huts. Their preparations were soon completed, and the Dutch then invited some of the Portuguese to join them in a shooting party, and even borrowed guns from them, pretending that their own were still aboard the ship. In the evening they entertained their guests to supper on the hill, and plied them so well with wine that they were unable to return to the castle. During the night the temporary walls were taken down, thus uncovering the now finished batteries, and when the Portuguese awoke, they were astonished to find themselves prisoners in a respectably fortified camp, with the surgeons commanding the plague-stricken crew, who now appeared as soldiers under arms and in the best of health. The Dutch captain at once sent to summon the few Portuguese who remained in the castle to surrender, threatening to butcher every one of them if they did not comply immediately. The ship, at the same time, stood in towards the shore and prepared to bombard the fortress from that side, and the governor, deprived of most of his officers as he was, had no alternative but to surrender. This ridiculous tale, invented by the Portuguese to cover the disgrace of their defeat, teems with so many palpable absurdities that it is utterly incredible. Their disposition towards all strangers who came to trade on the coast, and the treatment they consistently meted out to them, are too well known to admit for one moment of the belief that they would ever have permitted any foreign ship to resort to Elmina and enjoy the privileges here described. And even assuming that the governor himself had been bribed, it would still have been absolutely impossible for any of these preparations to have been carried out under the suspicious eyes of the other Portuguese officers. But in the case of the Dutch, the absurdity of the whole story is accentuated by the facts that they had a settlement of their own at Mori, only a few miles away from Elmina, to which they could have gone, and that they had already given unmistakable proof of their intentions by their attempt on Elmina only 12 years before this alleged deception. There can be no doubt, therefore, that the version previously given is the correct one. The only possible point that could be mentioned in support of the Portuguese story is the extraordinary similarity between the methods here attributed to the Dutch and those actually practiced by some others of their nation in another part of Africa within recent times. Though it is now over 2.5 centuries since the Portuguese were finally driven from the Gold Coast, many traces of their 160 years occupation are still to be found in words in common use and in geographical names. The Dutch and English, however, have left few such marks. This may be due to the fact that the Portuguese mixed more with the people than these other nations have ever done, but is more probably attributable to the perpetuation of the names originated by the Portuguese in a translated or slightly corrupted form. Examples of such words of Portuguese derivation are palaver, palabra, panha, apanha, fetish, feitiço, piccaninny, picanha, cabaquer, cabeceiro, and dashme, dasme. Many of the old Portuguese geographical names, too, still persist as Gold Coast, Costa del Oro, Cape Three Points, Cabo de Tres Puntas, Cape Coast, Cabo Corso, Elmina, San Jorge del Mina, River Volta, Rio Volta, River Ancobra, Rio Cobre, and many others. Many of these names used by them, on the other hand, have quite disappeared, and Penny is no longer known as Terra Paquena, nor the River Pra as the Rio San Juan. It was the Portuguese, too, who first introduced cattle into the country and the prickly pear with which to fence their enclosures. They are said to have also brought Indian corn and the sugar cane from the island of San Tome and the banana and pineapple from the Congo. It is also asserted that some parts of the funeral customs and other ceremonies of the people, especially in the neighborhood of Elmina, show some traces of the influence of the Roman Catholic ritual, and this may very possibly be the correct explanation of their origin, for the Portuguese, so long as they were on the coast, adhered to this object of Prince Henry, and maintained missionary priests to instruct the people in their religion. Nor were these the only missionaries on the coast, for Barber records the fact that some French Capuchin priests were sent out to Assini in 1635 and at first made some progress among the people, who treated them very courteously and seemed to have some relish of Christianity. But soon after they scoffed at them and their doctrine. 3 of these men died at Assini, and the other 2 then withdrew to the Portuguese near Axim, being no longer able to bear with the insulting behavior of the blacks and their deriding of the Christian religion.